Soybeans, the con of the century. Wherever you are, welcome to another of my takes on China. And this afternoon, my wife showed me a short video that's doing the rounds on Chinese social media. She asked me if it's true. There was a man in the US who was bemoaning that his business is going down the gurgler. He was a soybean farmer, and China hadn't placed an order this year. Now, I do know that that's changed in the last few days, and it changed after Malaysia, or the Malaysian talks. That part is the good news. But what it made me think was this. How is an industry so dependent on one country for its survival? That would be stupid, wouldn't it? Then I discovered they aren't stupid. It isn't. It's a big lie, a big propaganda facade. The American soybean industry wants China, but it doesn't actually need China. Think about this. How many importers are getting interviewed in their businesses by Fox News, CNN, etc.? Every one of them is suffering with tariffs, paying more, having to absorb the cost or increase their prices, thanks to Donald Trump. And Scott Bessent is telling everyone that China's paying the tariffs. China isn't. The importers are. But we're seeing hardly any interviews of them because they don't fit the narrative. The narrative being that China is deliberately hurting American farmers, but America is fighting back with their tariffs. Now think about how many soybean farmers have been interviewed by Fox News. I've seen a lot. If you're paying any attention to X, YouTube, TikTok, or any other social media that shows short video clips, how many farmers have you seen interviewed or posting videos of doom and gloom from inside the cabs of their tractors? Some of them ending the clip sobbing their hearts out because it's not just their business but the entire industry and the country that's being destroyed by these evil commies. I've seen many, and even my wife has seen them on Chinese social media. It's a global campaign to make China look bad. China hasn't imposed a single first tariff on the USA. Every action China has taken is a reaction to something the US, or more specifically, I should say, the Trump administration did first, followed by the Biden administration, which didn't undo anything. Trump did that, but then Biden doubled down on some of them, only to be trumped by Trump. This isn't China's fault, it's caused by Trump decisions. If it's happening at all, it's very much the farmers' own fault, especially if they voted for Trump because he did it to the farmers before, in 2018 and 2020. So I thought I'd look into how this happened and explain why I know America is lying to the world. Sure enough, China has traditionally been one of the largest customers of soybeans from America, but then it stopped. And in fact, the first time, or last time it stopped, was 2018. Guess who was president then? Yes, Donald J. Trump. So why wasn't the industry wrecked then, in his first term? What did the soy farmers do then? Instead of diversifying their markets, diversifying their crops, they got on Twitter, as it was called, and complained. Now that's what's happening again. They're complaining on X about the fact that they're farmers and they haven't got enough income to buy food. And then I thought, as an aside, and completely unrelated to this story, there's a big difference between farmers in China and farmers in the USA. One actually is a farmer. The other is a well-paid operator of industrial agricultural machinery. There is no doubt in China that farmers are, generally speaking, poor people. They don't earn great income. Farmers in the US have an average salary of $46,000, and employees on farms should be paid $23 per hour, which of course rich farmers don't want to pay, so many of them employ migrants, non-English speaking Americans, student workers, or slave labor prisoners, or illegal immigrants to cut costs. But $23 is what they should be paid per hour. Look it up. However, farmers in China never go short of food because they might be rice farmers, corn farmers, wheat farmers, even cotton farmers, which you can't eat. But every home in rural China has its own chickens. They probably have a couple of pigs too. Out west, they'll have a few sheep. They're farmers, after all. They have an area outside their home where the farmer's wife, mother, or even grandmother, or all of them, are constantly out there growing, tending to their own vegetables to eat around the family table, to sell in the local market, or to trade for something they haven't got on their own farm. That's what farmers do. If soybean farmers are going hungry, they really only have to look at themselves for the blame. They're farmers. Start farming. And if they are machine operators, appeal to the government for food stamps and handouts, because there's no doubt it's the government which has caused their problem, if there is a problem. In any event, it's sad that American peasants are struggling when Chinese peasants, according to J.D. Vance, are doing so well. Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Besant said China had agreed to buy 12 million metric tons this season and would increase to 25 million metric tons for the next 3 years. Great news for American soybean farmers, no doubt. Almost certainly, no, definitely a lie, fake news. First of all, China has not announced any figures. It might be that in Malaysia these figures were touted and accepted by China as the number the US wanted them to buy, but the reality is different. So I asked Qiwen.ai, a Chinese AI platform, for an answer. It gave me a comprehensive response, but the short conclusion was this, and I quote, "The idea that China formally agreed to buy 12 million tons this year and 25 million tons annually for 3 years is not accurate. It likely stems from optimistic projections, misinterpretations of the Phase 1 deal, or political rhetoric, possibly including statements by figures like Scott Bessent rather than actual negotiated terms. In short, it's more wishful thinking or political framing than a verified commitment." End of quote. Now, because Qiwen.ai is a Chinese system, I thought I'll ask ChatGPT, and it pretty much said the same things. And once again, I quote, "It looks like Scott Bessent might be drawing from broader trade expectations or informal negotiations rather than a concrete signed deal. The specified numbers you're asking about, 12 million tons of soybeans this year and 25 million for the next 3 years, do not appear to be a formal, publicly agreed upon commitment that has been confirmed by official sources in recent trade talks." So why do ChatGPT and Qiwen AI think the same as me? Because it's clear to me that this didn't seem right. Well, it all points back to 2020. In January, when a trade deal was to overcome Trump's first tariffs was worked out, China agreed to buy agricultural products, not just soybeans, at above 2017 latest. And I quote again, "Under the US-China Phase 1 trade deal signed in January 2020, China committed to increase purchases of US goods, including agricultural products, by at least $40 to $50 billion over 2 years, 2020 to 2021, compared to 2017 levels. However, the agreement did not specify exact tonnages for soybeans or other individual commodities. It set aggregate targets for agricultural purposes, for example, 36.5 billion in ag goods over 2 years, but not binding annual quotas. China never formally committed to buying fixed volumes like 12 million tons this year or 25 million tons per year for 3 years. And that means it's definite Scott Bessent is not only wrong about this, he is once again lying to the American public. China might buy 25 million tons of soybeans, but it's far more likely that it might not. And then Bessent or Trump will once again accuse China of reneging on a deal which it never made. And it's almost certain that China will not buy this much from America. And one reason I give for that is that Bessent has calculated the value of $36.5 billion from 5 years ago, extrapolated it over 3 years, and created a number based on today's value of soybeans, a completely wrong analysis of future sales on all ag products. Another is that China has already diversified its market. According to one reliable source, in 2024, China bought a total of 985 bushels of soybeans. Why is the US the only country in the world still using bushels? That's another question, but let's leave that little idiosyncrasy alone for now. It amounted to 26 million metric tons of soybeans and represents the entire incorporated amount of American soybeans that arrived in China for the year. Remember this number, 26. It's important. China imported 12.26 million tons of soybeans in June alone, another record month, but most of it came from Brazil. It did the same in July, another record month for soybean imports coming from mostly Brazil. Another thing worthy of note is that Another reason why I'm certain we're being bombarded with propaganda rather than genuine farmers' grievances, in 2024, China accounted for 49% of the US soybean exports. Exports, a very important word there, meaning 51% of exports plus their domestic consumption were not going to China. It's still a very viable industry, so when we see farmers crying online, let's remember that and come back to it in just a moment. Here's an important statistic, and Trump might get credit for this. In July 2020, the largest day's trading in US agricultural history, China was rebounding from both imposed tariffs by Trump as well as a recovery from a swine fever which had culled many of the pigs which eat a lot of the soybeans imported. And they gave the USA a record day. 328,000 metric tons were sold for shipment to China that day alone. But the total for the year was still only 32.9 million metric tons in a record year. China bought 33 million tons, and now Besant says China will buy 25 million for the next 3 years. Some perspective is needed. We now know that China has the capacity to buy very big when it wants to. That sale in 2020 replenished reserves. It was a conciliatory gesture from Xi Jinping to Trump after his first waves of unilateral tariffs. In other words, China that day alone appears to have saved the US agricultural industry. But it's what happened in 2025 that becomes important. September 2025 was the first month ever in a soybean season that China has bought 0 soybeans from America. September the previous year was 1.7 million tons. This year, 0. Soybean farmers were sitting up and taking notice and screaming loudly from their tractors into the live streaming cameras about it. But that is all part of a coordinated and targeted propaganda campaign. Whatever happened to the 49% of the sales that are exported to other countries? How much of the domestic market remains in America? These are questions I had to look a lot deeper to find out. AP News, and I've linked it, suggests that China has consistently bought just a quarter of the US market. So there seems to be a lot of screaming for the loss of a major but not fatal client in their system. It definitely seemed from all the rhetoric and all the farmers on Fox News and social media that China has brought the soybean industry to its knees, and that is a lie. China has certainly hurt the American soybean market, but the domestic market for soybeans, that is the amount sold inside the USA to oil makers and stock feed producers, is always higher than its exports. We're being conned again by Besant. Over 50% of the market is consumed in America domestically. What is exported? 49% of that goes to China, but 51% goes to other countries. China isn't destroying the soybean industry. Suddenly, when the numbers are known, we learn that China accounts for less than 25% of all of USA's soybeans. They're crying wolf, or more appropriately, they're just crying. And it's all to make the US look good and China look bad. This is how propaganda works. In September 2025, China did something they haven't done before. They bought record amounts of soybeans from both Argentina and Brazil. Now, Brazil supplied over 10 million metric tons, and Argentina only 1.1 million metric tons, meaning in 1 month alone, China is buying 10 times more soybeans than it had from the US in the same month last year, which was a record month. June and July 2025 were also record months too, when the market with the USA was actually closed. China is already buying a lot more beans than it usually buys. It has now permanently diversified its supply lines, which is sensible given that the US is such an unreliable partner. And here's the thing, China is now well stocked with soybean reserves. It's not short of soybeans as it was in 2020. It's not recovering from an animal culling as it was in 2020. It's simply replenished stocks and storing against another glitch that the US is likely to create soon. It's extremely unlikely that China is going to disrupt the supply lines it has with Brazil, because Brazil has expanded its soybean production capacity to service a fellow BRICS member. Argentina is interesting because the price appears to have been subsidized by America's gift of $40 billion to help Milei's government get re-elected in their midterms. If that's true, It's a huge shot in the foot for America, but again, it's unlikely that it's true. What's more likely is that the Trump administration simply invested in a sovereign nation's leadership that it can control, and that would account for why China only bought 1.1 million tons. In the scale of things, it's minimal. I suspect now that Milei, who once said he would never deal with China, is more than happy to deal with China. But the US will be hoping to see China more reliant on Milei's government than they are, and then they can be denied, and he won't be able to sell to them. This is how to control two different sovereign nations, and that's what America wants to do. Once again, that's a different story for a different video. One thing is certain, China does not need to buy 12 million tons this year. It has stockpile reserves for any contingency already, and if by chance it needs 25 million tons from America next year, it would be at the expense of two suppliers, one of which is a BRICS member and the other is unreliable, but so small it wouldn't matter. I think it's possible that China will top up its needs from the US to keep them happy, but China knows that Besant is telling lies. American soybean farmers are being told lies and are telling lies. They were never going under. They were making TV shows to propagandize the American people into making them believe they were going under and to paint China in a bad light. Facts matter. And the single most important fact here is that China accounts for less than 25% of the entire US soybean market, or it did. I expect it will count for 1 or 2% this year and possibly less next year as Brazil and others ramp up their exports. The US soybean industry is not going under. It was never going under. It's had a glitch because they've upset their biggest customer who has gone elsewhere, but they have a massive industry serving other massive industries. Let's see the crying farmers for what they are. They're actors in a long line of a propaganda series designed to make a competitor look bad. The soybean farmers in the US have beef and pork industries, which both rely on them for fodder. They have a huge oil industry to use up any excess. There's also something else they haven't told us about while crying in their trucks, and that there's a huge market for soybeans-based biofuel, forecast next year to utilize 26% of all soybeans America can produce. The fact is, soybean farmers don't need China's business because if all that fails, they could eat more baked beans or develop a taste for tofu. It's not as bad as some people think. And that is the end of my take on China on the big soybean con. Thank you for sticking with me. I will see you next time, and bye for now.